Hi everyone, Paul Jackson here. This lecture, week 11, is the concluding input for the e-business module. And what we're going to do here is to look at issues bound up with introducing all of the ideas that we've been talking about on the module so far. We might well have come up with some great thinking about how we could create a new business, but how do you actually go about starting a new e-business organization? Or if you've got an existing firm, what are the issues bound up with implementing those ideas? So that's what we're going to cover in this lecture. There are two ideas we need to get familiar with here. One of them is the notion of the intrapreneur and the other the entrepreneur. The intrapreneur is somebody that you might not have come across before, because usually we talk about entrepreneurs, people that start businesses. Essentially these are people who work usually with a few other people to create something entirely new, an organization that didn't exist before. But there's also this notion of an intrapreneur, somebody who brings change to an established organization. So most of the e-business issues we've been talking about on the module will be implemented within an existing business, and if you're the sort of person that's driving these ideas forward in an existing business, we might well refer to you as an intrapreneur. There is a seminar exercise related to this topic. You can find it on the Moodle site, and it concerns a startup organization in the tech sector called Power, which rose to great prominence and then quickly fell apart. Now this provides some very interesting lessons for us, so you might have a look at the Moodle site and have a go at that seminar exercise. Now, if you are an existing business and you're introducing the sort of ideas we've discussed on this module, let's say you're a retail organization embedding more digital technologies and digital channels into the business, you're going to have to be introducing some major change into the organization. Existing ways of doing things, existing strategies and structures will need to be overhauled. This could be quite radical change to the organization. Not everybody's going to like it, so you could expect that there's going to be some form of resistance. So these are ideas that were set out a number of years ago in the Journal of Organizational and Change Management in an article by myself and Lisa Harris. So okay, that was a few years ago, but I think it still stands the test of time, and it's an article that you might wish to read. Now, we wrote this article soon after the so-called dot-com bomb, which happened just after the year 2000, and in it we were making an argument that it's important not to throw the baby out with the bathwater when it comes to existing businesses, because many bricks and mortar companies actually have strengths that a lot of pure native digital startups don't have. So they've got a presence, in many cases, if they're in the retail sector, out in the high street. They might have quite a good public profile. So these are not the sort of things that you would necessarily wish to damage if you're introducing new digital channels. So avoiding the baby and bathwater syndrome is quite important. Now, if we do have ideas in an organization to introduce digital projects, we can be pretty sure that other people in the organization will have ideas for other projects too. So the way this is typically dealt with is by putting together some sort of business case where we set out the rationale for change, the benefits that we expect from it, the costs bound up with it, and the risks that we're going to have to manage. And we're going to go head to head with people with other business cases, perhaps for non-digital projects. So the benefits that we might be looking at could be things like revenue enhancement. One thing we know is that if we look at retail, then in many cases it's firms' online channels that are the only ones generating new revenue, acquiring new customers, and increasingly it's actually the mobile channels that are doing that. Digital technologies might also help us in reducing our costs. They might help us in automating certain processes. They might improve customer satisfaction by allowing a 24/7 service, for instance. And they might make us more flexible as an organisation and help us to get things out to market much more quickly. There are also going to be costs involved in any project. Some of these will be recurring costs. We might, for instance, have to introduce new personnel with specialist skills in web development and analytics. Some, though, will be one-time investments, perhaps in equipment or training, although increasingly in the world of e-business, a lot of the costs are revenue costs because we can pay for things on an ongoing basis by hosting a lot of technology in the cloud. There are also risks that we're going to have to manage. If we're looking at digital investments, a lot of those are going to be technical risks, so we need to test those out. We also need to make sure that the organisation, the people within it, are willing to accept our ideas and our new ways of working, and also that customers are going to be attracted by doing things with digital technologies and new channels. Okay, let's look at the entrepreneurial side of e-business change. So this is where entrepreneurship comes in. So this is where a group of people are trying to create something new using digital technology. Wired magazine each year does a report on Europe's 100 hottest startups. So these are businesses trying to do something new and exciting with digital technology, trying to be, in many cases, the next Mark Zuckerberg or Jeff Bezos. Most of them, though, are not going to become multi-billionaires or even millionaires. So here's someone who could have been a multi-billionaire by the time he was 23, Evan Spiegel of Snapchat, who turned down the £3 billion takeover offer from Mark Zuckerberg. If you look at the PDF of these slides on Moodle, you can click on this image and read an article about him. More interesting perhaps is clicking on this, where you can watch a YouTube video with quite a funny but very interesting song all about internet startups. So there are lots of articles out there on how to build a winning startup, like this from Wired magazine. But let's face it, if there were rules on how to build a winning startup, we'd all be doing it and becoming millionaires ourselves. So these stories are worth listening to, but we've got to remember that there are no hard and fast rules on how to win in this business. There's a lot of luck, there's a lot of hard work involved. So let's remember one of the things we said right at the start of this module, that e-business is no different to any other change in an organisation or any other area of entrepreneurship. An online business is a business first. It must have all the basic and critical factors of a business, such as business strategy, operating an effective supply chain, having financial viability, providing superb customer service. So while it's important to have a plan that will set out the details of making a commercially successful business. It's also worth remembering that a plan is not enough in itself. An interesting point is made in this book by Eric Schmidt and Jonathan Rosenberg, two executives from Google, where they talk about the importance not just of investing in a business plan, but investing in the right team. So that sort of fit, that personal chemistry, is going to be important to investors and senior managers as well. So while there are no hard and fast rules for commercial success in creating an e-business, there are places that we can turn for advice. So one useful book, The Lean Startup by Eric Rice, is worth a look. So he's a guy that created a successful online company called InView. He's been an investor in various e-businesses, and he's also a speaker and a writer. And in this book he sets out 5 principles for startup success. He argues that entrepreneurs are everywhere. There's lots of people inside organizations as intrapreneurs and outside in all different sectors that have the potential to seize opportunities for e-business startups. That entrepreneurship is not just about having an initial great idea and then making everything happen. There's a lot of grind involved. There's a lot of careful day-to-day management to make sure that your idea leads to something commercially successful. At the heart of this, and at the heart of his advice, is something he calls the build, measure, learn cycle, which I'll go through in a moment. Part of this is what he refers to as validated learning, and this is what distinguishes a startup from perhaps a more established business, in that with a startup you don't really know if the market wants what you're offering. You may think you've got a great idea, but you've got to go out and test it, and you've got to learn from those experiments and essentially validate your learning in the marketplace. And finally, it involves a new way of accounting. So what he refers to as innovation accounting is better, it's suggested, than more traditional ways of accounting for change. So let's start with the definition. Eric Rice defines a startup as a human institution designed to create new products and services under conditions of uncertainty. Things are more uncertain in a startup environment because you've got a new product or service, something that nobody's really thought about before, and you don't really know what the market is going to think about it. So this is his organization InView that he created, and he tells the story in this book of the number of changes that they had to make and the challenges to their initial assumptions about what the product would be and what customers would value in it. And he also makes the point that entrepreneurs are really everywhere. You don't have to follow a cliched path in this. You don't have to work in a garage in California to become a successful e-business entrepreneur. You could even be an intrapreneur working within an established company and introducing new technology in it to do things in new ways. So entrepreneurship, says Eric Rice, is not just about having the initial ideas and being creative. That's the exciting part of the startup scenario, but management is essential as well, grinding out success on an ongoing basis. But you need an approach that's perhaps different to established organization, an approach to management that's more suited to the chaos and uncertainty of a new organization, and also an approach that is built around learning and adaptation. So not starting with fixed ideas and plans, but the ability to learn and change on the basis of experience. A key part of this, as I said a few moments ago, is what Rice calls the build, measure, learn cycle. Essentially, he's arguing that startups are about transforming initial ideas into products or services that customers want and value. But to do this, you need to go out and test your ideas. So what you're looking for is feedback and data about customers' experiences of your product. So this requires you to go through the cycle of building, measuring and learning, collecting data about what you're putting out into the marketplace and adjusting on the basis of that feedback. So the challenge is to try and get through this cycle as quickly as possible and keep repeating it. So a startup environment is very much like a laboratory where you're continuing to test, but you're doing it increasingly in a real live environment with real customers. A core idea here is what's referred to as the MVP, the minimum viable product. So the point here is, rather than doing lots and lots of market research and building prototypes, is to create the smallest possible commercial product that you can and put it out there in the marketplace so that real customers can get their hands on it and learn from that and develop that product or service over time. An MVP he defines as a product that enables a full turn of the build, measure, learn loop with a minimum of time and effort. And if you think about it, a lot of what we deal with today in terms of services like Facebook and Google, started out with a very simple service, and over time more functionality, more services were layered on top, but they had something that offered a lot of value initially that was viable as a customer proposition, and they learned from that and they built more things on top of it. So any business starts out with something simple, just a small product portfolio perhaps, and adds more things onto it over time. So this might remind us of the customer adoption cycle, for instance. We said that early on with products or new businesses, it's often the innovators or the early adopters that we're trying to get on board. And once we've revised our product or service or added some enhancements to it, it's then that we can start promoting it to a wider market. So initially, when we've got our minimum viable product, it might be a little bit clunky, but that's okay often for the leading edge consumers who are looking for something that's a bit different. So we don't have to have a fully finished product, and indeed sometimes the simpler the product, the more successful. Dropbox has been an enormously successful product, and there were similar propositions out there in the marketplace, but perhaps the elegance and simplicity of Dropbox, the fact that it's almost kept to its minimum viable productness, is what's made it quite successful. Rice talks about the importance of a pivot as you go through this build, measure, learn cycle. So we're always getting feedback, we're always learning. It may well be that our initial hypotheses prove false. We've got an idea of what might be successful or what customers might value, and we could be wrong. So we're faced with a choice there. Do we persevere? Do we just presume that our ideas might be correct and what we're trying to do is to optimize them? Or should we recognize that a major change is what's needed and that maybe our hypotheses are wrong? So working out whether we're in a situation whether we're optimizing or pivoting is quite critical, particularly early on in an e-business startup. So this leads on to the fourth key principle, the idea of validated learning. we're not just going forward on the basis of what we think customers want, but we're finding out what they really do want, what they really are doing with our product and service, and we're learning from that. So we're always testing our key assumptions and our hypotheses. And it's easy to do this in many cases with e-business. On a website, for instance, we can very easily test different propositions, different marketing campaigns, different designs to the web layout. So we can do that A/B testing, that split testing, and very quickly work out which is the best way to present something to a customer. The final principle that Eric Rice talks about is innovation accounting. So here in particular he talks about the idea of establishing learning milestones that are bound up with the drivers of growth. There's no point in a very uncertain environment of having some sort of fixed business plan that's going to return a return on investment of 20% in the next year, when maybe you could achieve 2,000% in the first year. Or maybe the challenge should not be to get a profitable return on your investment capital, but to ramp up the customer base because there's massive profits in later years. So learning milestones, he suggests, could be things like the activation rates of new customers, trying to get a bigger installed base of customers on board first, perhaps, before achieving commercial viability. When it comes to digital innovations, one way of thinking about creating a successful product is to think about customer habits and to try and create something that is going to worm its way into people's everyday activities. Now, this is something that Google often think about. They have their so-called toothbrush test. They want to create products and services that somebody will use at least twice a day. So these are some ideas from a book called Hooked, How to Build Habit-Forming Products, where we can think of the propositions that we're putting out there in terms of their frequency of use. Are they used less often or more often? And are they perceived as being more or less useful? So we can think of things like Google search or mobile phones, things that people are using several times, who knows, 100 times a day. Then there'll be things that have quite a lot of utility that we might not use quite as much, but we use them because we want to solve a particular problem. There are things that are perhaps less profitable that not many customers will buy, that have a less frequent use and are perceived as being less useful. Not everybody buys vitamin tablets, and even those that do perhaps question whether they offer much value. So this might be useful at the very start of creating a new product or service or e-business startup, by asking just questions about what is it that makes people tick, and how could we create an internet-based product or service or entire business that's based on people's deep needs and the sort of habits that they get into, and how we can support that with new products and services. So here's something for you to pause and perhaps stop the video for a few moments and think about. Which of these do you use often, and why do you use them? And also, what triggers you to use them at a particular point in time, and what keeps you coming back? If we can understand that about things like World of Warcraft or Snapchat or Facebook, we can learn a lot about how to create successful digital products. Okay, so something again from the Hooked model, and this essentially is about the process that customers go through in using those products and services that they get hooked on, that they get somewhat addicted to in the most positive sense. So this will involve some sort of internal trigger, something that comes from within the individual, or there might be an external trigger that prompts them into using the product or service. We've got to think through, well, what's the minimum, simplest behaviour that somebody might be able to take in anticipation of a reward such that they're going to use our product or service? Is there what's called variable reward? There's something fulfilling in using our product and service, but it's a little bit different each time so that we don't get too bored of it. And can we get them to invest a little bit of themselves in this so that they feel as though it's worth them coming back? There's some sort of sunk cost in using the product and service. If we can think about all of these and interconnect them, we've got the makings of a product or service on which customers might get hooked. So where are the internal triggers, for instance, for something like Gmail or Amazon? Essentially, Amazon are very good at being front of mind. They're there at the start of a user journey. We're thinking about something that we need or that we want to buy, and we think, okay, let's go to Amazon and search to see if they've got that. They probably have. So that's why our first step in that customer journey might start with Amazon. What's the trigger for using Gmail? Well, we're sitting on a bus or sitting at our desk. Maybe we're a little bit bored. Maybe we're curious if somebody's tried to contact us. Maybe we're expecting some message. So those are the sort of internal triggers that might cause us to go to Gmail to see if somebody has sent us a message. But the triggers might well come from outside of ourselves. So what is it that gets us looking at Facebook or Snapchat? Well, we're at our computer, or perhaps more likely on our tablet or our phone. And the way in which this is done, of course, is with notifications. A number pops up to say that there have been 2 updates or 12 people have been trying to contact us. So that's quite interesting. That gets us thinking, yeah, let's have a look at that. So that trigger is from outside, but we are in a position where we really want to know what's going on with each of those services. Now, we might not use the service in question. We might not go onto Facebook or Google if the action that we subsequently need to take when we've been triggered into some sort of action is going to take us 5, 10, 15 minutes. So what makes for a successful product or service, again, is something that involves some relatively simple action. It's pretty straightforward just to click on one item and see what the status updates are. Facebook immediately takes us with 1 or 2 clicks to those updates. Somebody has commented on a particular post, or it's very easy on Google. We don't even have to type anything. We can just press the microphone and we can do a straightforward search by voice. So to keep us interested and wanting to take some action in response to an internal or an external trigger, there has to be something interesting each time we go to that service or use that product. So this is where the idea of a variable reward comes in. There's a new comment, there's a new post on Facebook, or obviously there's a new email message. So these things might seem kind of obvious, but the fact that something new will be there each time is what keeps us coming back to it. So can we build that novelty into the products or services that we are creating? Another thing that keeps us going back to a service and becoming a more or less addicted habitual user is this idea of investment. Can we get customers to invest a little bit of themselves such that they'll feel as though they've got some stake in the product or service and that it's worth them maybe investing a bit more? So if we've written a status update on Facebook, we've done that, we've spent time doing that. We'll want to go and see what maybe people have said about that post. If we've engaged in World of Warcraft, we're going to want to know what's happened in that world. We've spent quite a bit of time doing that, so there's an incentive to keep coming back. So can we build that in to a new product or service that our startup might be creating? Okay, so we've thought about our product, we've thought about how we can make it something addictive that potential customers will get hooked on. We've thought about how we can go through a process of testing it out and going through that learning cycle. And we've then got to think about, well, where are we going as a business to locate ourselves, perhaps to recruit other people in order to build and grow our business. Now, we might intuitively think that in this digital world it doesn't really matter because we can have a completely virtual organization, and indeed, there's a lot of sense in that. But what we also find is that a lot of startups, particularly in the digital space, do tend to cluster in particular tech hubs. So this is a point that was made in a special report in The Economist, where they talked about the death of distance as having been much exaggerated. Many internet startups, they go on to say, head for San Francisco, New York, Berlin, London or other hubs to be close to like-minded people, as well as suppliers and potential investors, as we'll get onto in a moment. So it's also worth thinking about where in the world we might want to invest if we are putting money into an e-business startup. So here's some research that was published in the Harvard Business Review from the Fletcher School of Tufts University. And what this is looking at is different countries and their relative maturity in terms of digital capacity. So we've got the most mature countries in digital terms towards the top, but also we've got those countries that are either slowly or rapidly advancing, and those that might be receding either slowly or rapidly. So ideally, we'd want to be investing up here. So what we find is that countries like Singapore are very mature and they're continuing to advance in digital terms. The UK, number of European countries are still very mature, but they're pretty much standing still in relative terms. The breakout countries are the ones worth looking at, a number of them in South America, Chile, Colombia, but China, not surprisingly, Malaysia, countries that are increasingly mature and doing it at quite a rapid pace. As part of this, we also want to know where the talent is. Obviously, if we're working with advanced technologies, we want people with those cutting-edge skills. And okay, this is a few years old, but Global Professionals on the Move from this HR company does list 3 particular places where the technology movers and shakers are. Number 1, perhaps not surprisingly, the United States, particularly in California and New York. UK number 2 tends to be around London, and 3rd, Singapore. Talking of London, the focus of much startup activity is in the Shoreditch area of London, the so-called Silicon Roundabout, and a lot of businesses, some of them household names, Songkick, TweetDeck for instance, are located in that area, as are a number of the support organisations and investors. So we've talked about money, we've talked about investors. Let's go into that in a bit more detail. Truth is that money is important to any business, particularly in the e-business environment, where often success depends on the ability to ramp up and operate on a global scale. Now that's going to take quite a lot of resource and the ability to grow quite quickly. So as a business, do you have the resources to scale up? If you don't, then in a winner-takes-all situation, another business whose technology might not be as good as yours could well overtake you. So as I say, this is a bit tongue-in-cheek, but businesses often have 2 or 3 strategies or options in terms of how they get money into the business and what they want to do with the business. You might be one of these lucky teenagers that has a great idea, and Yahoo comes along and spends a few £1,000,000 on it and buys you out very early on in the process. But more likely you've got to prove yourself in some way in the marketplace. Amazon, for instance, a business that's often looking around to buy up startups at an early stage so they don't become head-on competitors, and also the earlier you buy them, the more cheaply you can acquire them. But for many businesses like Snapchat, the intention really is to hang in there and wait it out and go for an IPO, an initial public offering in due course, where your shares are put on the stock exchange in the open market. In the early stage of a business, though, before you go to IPO or perhaps get bought out, there are 2 classic routes, one after the other, for getting the capital that you need for growth. So-called angel investors, often known as business angels, and venture capitalists, or VCs. Now, angel investors and venture capitalists are quite different. The angels, or the business angels, are high net worth individuals using mostly their own money, coming into a business quite early on, so hence their investment is often known as Series A funding or startup funding. So these are people that will take more risk, but in return for that they would hope for more return. So they might be looking for at least 30 or 40% return on their capital, because not every investment is going to work out. So their investments might be a little bit lower than later ones coming into the business. So we might be looking at 25k to 150k for angel investments. They would certainly be seeking equity in the business. They would want a share of the equity, and they would be bringing their own experience and expertise. And these are people that might be part of the ecosystem in places like Shoreditch. And there is an association in the UK of business angels, some of which will specialise in digital business. As mentioned, there is also the world of venture capital, which follows on the back of the business angels. So these are people that tend to invest other people's money. They come in later on in the business cycle, hence it's often referred to as Series B funding. So this often takes place once we know that there's real potential for growth in a startup. So these are investors that are taking less of a risk than business angels, but perhaps expect a lower return. But they will invest a larger amount, $250,000 up to 20 or 30 million. Like angel investors, they'll be interested in a stake in the shares and might also request a seat on the board. And there is also an association of venture capitalists. As with the previous association, if you get the PDF of these slides and click on the link here, you can go straight to that website. So this really is entering the dragon's den, both with business angels and venture capitalists. And these are organizations or people that have been there before. They've made money, they've lost money. If you're a young, naive business, you're quite vulnerable in this situation, and I think this was well illustrated in the film The Social Network, which was all about, of course, Mark Zuckerberg and his friends and the founding of Facebook, so that's well worth viewing if you haven't seen it. It's also worth remembering that there's a risk in getting people prematurely into a business or getting investment in that you don't actually need. Not least are you sharing ownership of the business with more people, but you may well spend it on the wrong sort of things that the business doesn't need at that point in time. This is a point made by Michael Cusimano in his book on the business of software, and the point here goes for startups generally, where he talks about the kiss of death of venture capital funding. Here he says, venture capital funding, or even cash from a premature IPO, is artificial wealth. Startups are too likely to spend the money they raise to hire too many employees, pay high salaries to executives, furnish lavish offices, buy too much equipment, or invest in rocket science development projects. They incur a level of overhead that prevents them from ever making a profit. Hence they become bloated, and the last thing that you need as a startup is to be bloated. Remember, Eric Rice's book is called The Lean Startup, so the leaner, the better in most instances. Of course, before you really do need investment capital to ramp up the business, out there in the ecosystem of e-business, there's lots of stuff that you can do for free and do it yourself. This is what's called so-called bootstrapping, pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps. This is nicely set out by the website Mashable, where they talk of 7 tips for bootstrapping your startup, things that you can do to promote your business essentially by using what's out there in social media, especially for free. The exciting thing is that there's lots of $1 million and even $1 billion businesses just waiting to be created. They just require the ideas and the effective entrepreneurial management, and at the right moment in time, the injection of investment capital to make it all happen. And a lot of the technologies for doing that are probably already around. You've probably seen them. As William Gibson said, the future is already here. It's just not very evenly distributed. And the channel for the startup or the entrepreneur is taking the initial ideas and often pre-existing technology and really pointing it like a laser beam on a new business concept, going through that learning cycle, getting the partners and the investment on board, and building a successful e-business that could even take on the world.